We're going to be going over writing equations of lines, but we're going to be focusing on how they are represented in word problems. There is a PowerPoint on reviewing how to create equations of lines given a point and a slope or 2 points, and you can go through that PowerPoint first if you want. But if you feel comfortable with how to make the equation of a line, we're going to go through this example. So here's your word problem. Abigail buys a prepaid card for her cell phone. When she talks on her phone, a fee per minute is deducted from the value of the prepaid card. After 10 minutes of use, there is $22 remaining on the card. After 20 minutes, there is $19 remaining on the card. We want to create an equation to model the scenario. So, as with all questions, in order to make the equation of a line, you need two things. You need to know what the slope is, or rate of change, and you need to know what the y-intercept is, or the initial value. Now, in these questions, there's always going to be two variables. One is going to be the independent variable, and one is going to be the dependent variable. So you get that information from these questions. They're going to give you two values, such as here. After 10 minutes, there is $22 remaining on the card. So one variable is time in minutes, and the other variable is the amount of money on the card. And then you have to decide which one is dependent and which one is independent. So does how much money remaining on the card depend on how much time you have used the phone? Or does how much time you have used the phone depend on how much money is left in the card? So what you would deduce is that the amount of money on the card depends on how much time you have used. So the time is your independent variable, and the amount of money on the card is your dependent variable. Now what you want to do is to pick any kind of variable. Some people still use x and y, but you don't have to represent the two variables and write let statements. Usually when there's word problems, people like to pick letters that represent that better represent what the variable is. So the independent variable is time. So the units are minutes, but the variable is time. So you could use x for the independent, or you could use t. T is equal to the time in minutes. And for the dependent variable, it is we can say A for amount left on card. And the unit is dollar signs. So whenever it is a word problem, you will have to make the let statements. Apparently I can't spell. And you need two let statements, one for the independent variable, one for the dependent variable. Again, you can use x for the independent and y for the dependent, or you can use letters that better represent what the variables are. So what we need to figure out is what is the slope and what is the y-intercept. And the way you do that depends on what has been given to you. Have you been told what the rate of change or the slope is? In some questions you have, and you don't need to do anything to determine the slope. Have you been told what the initial value is? In some questions you have, in some questions you haven't. So if you have not been told what the rate of change is, you need to use the slope formula to determine the rate of change. So in this case, the points are First one, 10 minutes for $22. So the independent is the first one, which is 10 minutes. And the dependent is the second one, which is 22. And your second point, the time is 20 minutes. So after 20 minutes, there is $19 left. So remember, you always want to put your independent variable first because that's like your X, and your dependent variable second because that's like your Y. So in this case, the 10 and the 20 are the values of the independent variable, which is traditionally the X, but we're using T, so that's T1 and T2. And the values of 22 and 19 are the dependent, which are traditionally the Y, but we're using them as A's, so that's A1 and A2. So again, you can use X and Y if you want, but to find the slope or the rate of change, we would normally write y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, but in this case, we're using A's, so it's A2 minus A1 for the Y's, and for the X's, we're using T, so it's T2 minus T1 for the X's. So on the top, your 19 is your A2, and your 22 is your A1, and that's over. The 20 is your T2, and the 10 is your T1. So that is equal to -3 over 10. Now, normally we ask you to leave it as a fraction, but when it is a word problem, you can write it as a decimal because this is representing the rate of change, and because it's involving money, you'd round it to 2 decimal places. So basically what this is saying is that the amount of money on the card is decreasing by 30 cents per minute. So if it wasn't a word problem, you'd leave your slope as a fraction, but when it is a word problem, you can change it to a decimal. Now, to determine the y-intercept, you need to use the equation of the line. Usually it would be y equals mx plus b. But in this case, your y is a and your x is t. So you'll find even in your homework the equations aren't written as y equals mx plus b using y and b. They're in that format, but the y is some other letter and the x is some other letter because it depends on which letters are being used here. So it's still in the y equals mx plus b format, but it's just a bit different letters. So the first thing you're going to do is, we know that the slope is -0.30. So you're going to substitute that in for the slope. And to solve for the y-intercept, what you're going to do is take either one of these points and substitute it in for the t and the a. You can choose either one. So let's just use the first point. So 22 goes in for the a, and that's equal to -0.30, and 10 goes in for the t, plus b. So now -0.30 times 10 would be -3. And solve for b, add 3 to both sides. So that means you would get b is equal to 25. So that's telling you that the initial value is $25. Your rate of change is negative 30 cents, and your initial value is 25. So that means your equation is going to be equal to A equals negative 0.30 t plus 25. So we are starting with $25, and for each minute, the amount on the card is decreasing by 30 cents. Now, just as a little sidebar, there's one thing that you could do in this example. It does not work in all examples, but in this example, if we have time and we have the amount on the card, if you know that your points, you've got 10 and you've got 20 for the T's, and you've got 22 and you've got 19 for the A's. If you see the first differences in the T's is 10, and the first differences in the A's is negative 3. Remember, it is y2 minus y1. So to go from 22 to 19, you're subtracting 3. To go from 10 to 20, you're adding 10. Now, in this case, if you were to continue the first differences, that would make the time equal to 0. So if you were to continue the first differences here, that would make the A value 25. And then to be able to find the initial value, you could just figure it out using a table of values instead of doing this work. However, this doesn't always work, because if this was 10 and this was 25, then this difference would be 15. And then if you continued it with 15, this would end up being negative 5. So it doesn't always work, but sometimes you can use the table to figure out the initial value. So just keep that in mind. And if it doesn't make sense, just continue to do it this way. But it is possible sometimes to just analyze the data to figure out what the initial value would be. So once again, some of the questions will tell you what the rate of change is, which means you don't have to do this part. Some questions will tell you what the initial value is, which means you don't have to do this part. But some questions won't tell you either. They'll just give you two separate points. So use the slope formula to figure out the rate of change. Use the y equals mx plus b formula to figure out the initial value, and then put them together into an equation. But please remember to make let statements for your two variables.